Welcome to our second live recording of the podcast. You may notice a lot of times when I'm recording, not live, when I'm recording a pre-recorded thing for the podcast, I usually start with a thought, related to the podcast. But this time I've been sitting here chatting with the folks who are on live, sort of in this like green room kind of space in the Zoom before I started the recording. We've been chatting just about stuff. And so if you want to come next week, I'm offering in the same format. I'll email out the link to either the folks who signed up and either could or couldn't make it. We'll get the link first to sign up for next week's, which will be Wednesday, August 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you get to hang, we're hanging out on Zoom beforehand. I'm doing the recording and then we're hanging out on Zoom afterwards, and it's super fun. So the topic of this week's podcast is the new moon in Cancer, in sidereal Cancer, in Ashlesha Nakshatra. It's happening Sunday, August 4th, around 7:12 a.m. Eastern Time. So I always give the times in Eastern Time. It's not that serious if you're in a different time zone. We have folks here live in different time zones, folks all over that listen to this podcast. What you need to know, really, what's important about that is not necessarily the exact moment the new moon is happening, but what's important to know is that it's really over Saturday night into Sunday morning that the moon will sort of reach its peak of the new phase. And so let's talk about what that means on this podcast episode. I'll go into all of the astrological sort of archetypes that are factoring into how we make our meaning about this new moon. And as always, we end with yoga practices and journal prompts for whatever astrological topic we're covering to help you maybe bring it down to earth a little bit more, bring it down to the body with your yoga practices that I'll share at the end, and then maybe think about it more in a practical sense in your life with the journal prompts on every episode we end. With that, that's what a Yogiscope is. So welcome to the Yogiscopes podcast officially. I'm your host, Rosemary Holbrook. I'm a Vedic sidereal astrologer and a yoga therapist. So that still feels really new for me to say. For those of you, the folks here live have been listening for a while. Those of you that might have been around a while, since I started this podcast, I've been working on that certification since before. And just like a month ago, I actually just got officially like all the paperwork through with the IAYT, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And so it still feels new for me to say, to call myself that. That's a new identity to embrace for me. But what that means for you is this work here is applying the therapeutic wisdom of yoga through these specific practices, like the yoga practices I'll share at the end, to your maybe more emotional landscape or inner landscape, which is the things that we might be able to see in the astrology. And so what's important about that too is that we use the Vedic sidereal system of astrology. And so if you're out there on the internet, if you're newer to this podcast, newer to deeper astrology studies in general, it is quite possible that in your brain before, astrology was just a monolith, like it's just astrology. And so just stick with me, keep with it. Even if I say things that feel confusing, the more you practice, kind of like with yoga, the more you practice over time, it will make more sense. Things will start to click in your brain a little bit more. But what's important in the short term for the new moon is if you're out there on social media, on the internet, they're likely saying, the drone of the internet is likely saying that this new moon is in Leo. And so Vedic astrology uses a different set of tools, including the nakshatras that we'll talk about on this episode. But it also uses a different zodiac, the sidereal zodiac, as opposed to the tropical zodiac, which would be saying that the new moon is in Leo, I think. Sometimes I feel like I get that direction backwards. But the sidereal zodiac is closer to astronomically accurate. And I'll leave it at that for now. I have more resources about it on my website. If you just go to yogiscopes.com, spelled just like this podcast, /blog, or click on articles at the top when you get there. There's some resources you can dive into to start learning. There's an article specifically about the differences between Western and Vedic astrology, and there's plenty of more resources in that article if you want to dive in. So, first little housekeeping announcement before we dive into the new moon. Like I was mentioning earlier, look out for an email from me on usually Friday. This Friday I'll send out a sign by sign, so a deeper personalized horoscope for the new moon. And with that, I will also include, to anybody who didn't register for this live recording, the link to register for next week's live recording, Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is 11 a.m. Pacific, or noon Mountain time. So this new moon's happening in Cancer. And so in a moment, I'll talk more specifically about the details of Cancer, the details of the nakshatra, the lunar mansion where this new moon is happening, because that's what sort of brings to life what might make this new moon different from any other new moon. So, for example, for a lot of yoga teachers, I'm in this like Facebook group that's where yoga teachers like share sequencing ideas, and everybody's like, I'm teaching a full moon class. Do you have any ideas? And folks will be like, moon salutations. And so that's pretty generic. Sure, we can do moon salutations for a new moon or a full moon to connect with the moon in general, but the Vedic astrology is what will help get even more subtle with connecting to what might be going on with this particular new moon. And so with that, nothing happens in a vacuum. This new moon is happening in Cancer, in the sign of Cancer. And there's other stuff happening in the sign of Cancer that you might like to know about. One being that Mercury is retrograde in Leo, or will be going retrograde in Leo right around the time of the new moon. And Mercury will finish that retrograde in Cancer, in this particular nakshatra, in Ashlesha nakshatra. And I spent some time talking about that on the Mercury retrograde episode that aired last week. So some of this will be a recap, but like I mentioned on that episode, we're going to go more deeply into the new moon. But why that matters, why I'm bringing it up again, is because you might want to pay attention to what potentially like what issues were presented really in the weeks leading up to the new moon, so that you can maybe set your intentions around like how you want to intentionally use not only this next lunar cycle, because Mercury will also be going direct and then moving again through this same section of the sky where this new moon is happening around the time of the next new moon. So that means this entire lunar cycle can kind of be dedicated to how you want to work with potentially a lot of these issues that Mercury retrograde is bringing up. So they're pretty related, as they often are, because Mercury moves so closely with the sun. The area that Mercury retrogrades through is usually pretty close to the area where the new and full moons will be happening. And so just to bring that to life with an example on a more global scale, I talked about on the Mercury retrograde podcast episode the CrowdStrike glitch, which happened the night that it happened. It was like overnight, Thursday night into a Friday morning. What was happening astrologically that night is Mercury, which rules over the nervous system, rules over travel, communication. So things like, it makes me think of that Audio Slave song. Sorry if you're like of a different generation and that doesn't, but you're not the rolling wheels, you are the highway. So Mercury is the highway. It's like the systems of communication, right? It's not necessarily what gets sent, if that makes sense. And so what I'm trying to point out is that often with these travel delays that happened with that CrowdStrike glitch, most people probably still made it to their destination. There was just like a hiccup on the way, right? There was this tech glitch, which is very Mercury retrograde. And so what I'm pointing out is that happened right when Mercury was moving between Ashlesha and Magha, so between Cancer and Leo, which is what we're going to talk about a lot on this particular podcast episode, because this new moon is happening in Ashlesha. It's not in that Gandanta zone, but it will soon after be, because the moon moves so quickly. So while the moon is still new, it will be moving through the same Gandanta zone. And so I spent some time talking about this on the Mercury retrograde episode. So Gandanta basically, you could think of it as like it creates steam, because it's when any planet, the moon included, is moving from a water sign, which Cancer is a water sign, into a fire sign. And when you combine water and fire, you get steam, right? You also get, Gandanta is related, it sort of translates to the knot end. So if you think of like a knot at the end of a rope, and you can either like hold on and grip really hard, or you can kind of let go and release. And with any of this spiritual work, we're trying to work on patterns, right? And like with yoga, we think of, we want to like free up the flow of prana. So we don't want any knots. We don't want these blockages, these knots. And so at the time that planets are moving through this Gandanta zone between water and fire, and particularly right at that moment where the switch happens, which is what we saw with this CrowdStrike glitch, right at that moment where Mercury moved through that Gandanta zone and changed signs, is when this big fiasco happened related to IT, which is, so what we're going to talk about with Ashleisha being sort of related to information that's like right under the surface. It's like right under your nose. It's there, but it's maybe not in the forefront of your awareness. So CrowdStrike is a like cybersecurity thing, and maybe I'm not doing justice to that explanation, but that's a really good example of like, it's right there. I had never heard of it before this event happened, this big like global news breaking event happened. But it was clearly right there under the surface, impacting so many of our day-to-day lives in such a big way. And so that's the vibe of Ashleisha. And Mercury rules over communication, the nervous system, all of those kind of things. Very related, but the moon is more related to our emotions and our sort of mental state. So what I want to point out is that your emotions and your nervous system are interrelated, right? Like they impact each other. When you have an emotional experience, it can impact your nervous system state. Like if you move into a state of stress or anger, for example, it will upregulate your nervous system, put you into that fight or flight. And same thing if you, like through the practice of yoga, I feel like this is what I'm often teaching about, or especially lately, like with my in-person classes, yoga classes I'm teaching, is that you can impact your nervous system state and likely also your emotional state through especially the breath, right? The breath is that link to, if you can slow the breath, you can slow the heart rate, you can soften the nervous system out of that fight or flight response, which often can affect your emotional state. If you're feeling really upregulated, really stressed, maybe in that fight or flight zone, you do have some control through the breath to alter your nervous system and then potentially also your emotional state. So they're related, they impact each other. And what we're seeing with that in astrology is the moon is that emotional state and the Mercury is the nervous system. So that's like the big theme right now, is what I'm trying to point out, is that this Mercury retrograde is, they tend to be really impactful for folks. Mercury retrogrades do, because there's this thing in Vedic astrology called Chesta Bala. It means like speed, strength based on speed. And so the slower a planet moves, the more strong it is. And so we can see that with like Saturn. Saturn is the slowest moving planet of the personal planets. And so it has the strongest, it's kind of like an undertow, Saturn is, or like an undercurrent. It's very strong. You cannot fight against it, but it's also like under the surface. Whereas Mercury is other than the moon, Mercury and moon are the quickest moving planets. And so their effects on like the overall trajectory of your life tend to not be that consequential. They're more like your day-to-day. But when they slow down, when Mercury slows down and goes retrograde, it gets more noticeable because the slower it goes. And so if it's moving backwards, it's moving really slow if you're considering forward motion as speed. It gets more impactful. So even people that aren't paying attention to astrology are really able to notice the effects of Mercury retrograde. And so that's big. And so this theme of like nervous system regulation is big. But this new moon is a chance to sort of consider your emotions around it. So let's talk a little bit more about why I say that. Because the moon in general represents the mind and emotions. Those are like the two biggest keywords we could associate with the moon. And Cancer is the only sign that is ruled by the moon. And I say that because most other planets rule two signs, with the exception of the moon rules Cancer and the sun rules Leo. And those are the only two signs that the sun and the moon respectively rule. And the rest of the planets pretty much rule two signs. And so that matters. But the biggest takeaway, I would say, from me bringing that up is that Cancer is also very much associated with your emotional state. And it gets those qualities from the moon, I suppose, is what I'm pointing out. And so at a new moon in Cancer, it's a good time to consider your sort of emotional undercurrent that you have going on. Like, what is your sort of usual emotional state? And like I was saying, we have more control over that than maybe anything else, or maybe even than we feel like we do. And so that's all I really wanted to say about that, just to point out like why emotions are being brought up so much at this new moon. And so also a new moon in general is when the sun and the moon completely conjoin in the sky. They're at the same degree point. So that's time I gave you, 7:12 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday, August 4th, is the time that they come to the exact same degree. So that's the astrological new moon, which if they're at the exact same degree, that means they're aligned in the sky from our viewpoint, which means the moon is not reflecting any of the sun's light, because that's all the moon does. It doesn't give off light itself. It's not a source of light. It just reflects light from the sun. And so the further it gets from the sun, the more light it reflects, right? So at a full moon, it's completely lit up, receiving all of the sun's light on, one entire side. And so that factors into how we work with new and full moons. So a new moon is a time, the dark moon, you can consider it like a seed, and it's only growing from there. So it's a time to set your intentions. Just in a broad strokes, at a new moon, we set intentions. Broad strokes, at a full moon, we bring things to fruition, or we release them because they've either been brought full circle, brought to fruition, or because they're no longer aligned. So new moon for new growth, full moon for completion, right? And that's broad strokes. So then we apply the archetype of Cancer to this new moon. So we want to consider like what intentions are we setting around our emotions, our sort of internal landscape as it relates to our emotions. And very much related to that is specifically the mother. So the moon represents the mother in general, and so does Cancer. Cancer has this relation to like, do you have a mother wound? Like, how have you been mothered? How have you been nurtured? How does that impact how you nurture yourself in your adulthood, or your overall feelings of safety within yourself, security within yourself in your adulthood? And so we'll talk more about that in the yoga practices and journal prompts. But let's dive in a little bit deeper with the nakshatra. So this nakshatra where the new moon is happening is Ashlesha, which, as I mentioned, that's where Mercury will be finishing up its retrograde and really like moving back through Ashlesha at the time of the next new moon. So at the complete end of this lunar cycle. So with any new moon, we might be setting intentions. You could set intentions for like a longer term scale than that for sure. Certainly I encourage it. But if you're working with every single new moon, really you're going to kind of set new intentions at every new moon, right? And so this whole lunar cycle from now until the next new moon, what's going on with Mercury will be at the forefront of the mind. And so, as I mentioned on that episode, there are big connections because of where it's moving through Leo and this nakshatra Ashlesha to lineage and to like generational trauma, lineage healing, that kind of stuff. And so that archetype comes specifically like Magha, the nakshatra in Leo. You can listen to the Mercury Retrograde episode if you want to dive more into that. But this nakshatra Ashlesha has its own connections to that, being so Ashlesha is represented by a snake, a serpent, and it translates to coiling or entwining. And the ruling deity of the nakshatra is Nagas, which is the serpent deities of wisdom. So I bring all those things up because that's how we make the meaning about like, what does this full moon mean? We look at all of these archetypes and translations and things to like kind of turn it into like, what does that mean in our lives? So the coiled serpent, I'll get into the lineage healing thing in just a second. Let's just like start with the basics. The coiled serpent, as you may know if you practice yoga, or maybe you're new to this, that's okay. The coiled serpent is related to the idea of Kundalini energy at the base of the spine. And so Kundalini, I'm going to try not to be like confusing about this, but it is a point of confusion for people, especially if you're newer to like all of this yoga philosophy stuff. Kundalini is like a brand of yoga, and it is an idea from yoga philosophy. So Kundalini, like the brand of yoga, was, I guess, founded or popularized by this guy who has since fallen from grace for a lot of reasons. And so what I want to point out is that I'm not trying to talk about that, the brand of yoga. I'm talking about this idea that brand of yoga was often, trying to approach or teach around. I'm not talking about the brand. I'm talking about the idea. I'm not talking about the brand or the practice. I'm talking about this idea that you have this Kundalini energy that's like sitting at the base of your spine waiting to be activated, and it's like a snake, like a coiled snake. And if you've ever been in India, they have these like little snake charmers that go around, and I'm almost positive that it's kind of like animal cruelty. Anyway, I saw a snake charmer when I was in India, and they do the thing where they play the music and the snake like, comes up. So that's the idea we're talking about. The snake's coiled in a little basket and it comes up. And so that's like the idea, animal cruelty or not, it at the base of your spine, you have that, and the snake energy will come up when you've activated it. When you've had a Kundalini awakening or a spiritual awakening, you've activated that energy via like aligning your chakras or whatever. This energy can move up the spine. And that is the idea of Kundalini energy. Kundalini yoga is maybe trying to activate that or keep it activated on a regular basis. But regardless of the practice, there might be something lying in wait in you, waiting to be activated. And so what often happens with a spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening, if you will, is there is some perhaps truth within you that kind of like once you've let the cat out of the bag, there's no like unseeing it or no turning back. And that's what we talk about with the spiritual awakening. And so I've also heard that with like people in recovery. that is common is like once you've experienced recovery after like being in addiction, it makes it like not the same. If you relapse, it's like you've had a taste of that recovery and you can never kind of unsee it. And so you can also apply that to other things. Once you've had that glimpse of truth or that spiritual awakening, you can't unsee it. So if you kind of go back to whatever the darkness is, it doesn't have to be substance use. It could be a lot of things. That truth has been awakened within you, and it will always sort of be nagging at you. And so that is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about Kundalini energy, is like there is some truth and you may or may not have had a glimpse of it at some point in your life. And we get really creative and really skilled at ignoring it when it's inconvenient or whatever. But that's what this new moon is sort of asking you to like unleash within yourself, is that what is your coiled serpent of wisdom, of spiritual wisdom, that's sort of sitting at the base of your spine, wanting to be charmed upwards, if you will. So sorry if that's a bad visual, but hopefully it makes sense. And so let's dive a little bit more into this symbolism of snakes, because that's really, the whole vibe of this Ashlesha Nakshatra, and diving into the symbolism of snakes is what will help us sort of understand the vibes that's being brought up by this new moon. And so the other long-standing symbolism of snakes is that they're like mysterious, right? Like for a long time, nobody could figure out how snakes actually moved. I think I've heard like myths that they like sprout legs and they walk and then they put their legs away or something. Like people couldn't figure it out. And even once there was like more modern science, it took a while to figure out like how do they even move? Like how does that even work? They're mysterious, right? Like they're kind of freaky to some people. And there's also this long-standing archetype of snakes that they're poisonous, and so that makes them sort of like suspicious, like you can't trust a snake, like they might just strike at any time, and that they also have this energy of deception. Like we can really see that archetype strong in the like Christian mythology with like the Garden of Eden and the snake tricked them and made them eat the apple and whatever. But that shows up other places too, is that snakes they're deceptive. They'll just like strike and poison you, and they'll like lure you in, right? So there's this air of mystery and of maybe even suspiciousness around snakes. And so what that matters for the new moon is, I think, also this sort of spiritual awakening thing that everybody's always like, we're all trying to figure it out, like myself included. It's kind of mysterious. Like most of us don't really know how it works. And that's why we study astrology and practice yoga, because we're trying to wrap our head around this thing that we don't really understand, right? And it is like snakes. Sure, they can bite you, they can poison you, but snakes are actually like neutral. Like they're not going to hurt you unless they get backed into a corner, right? So, and they're also protective over, like their space and their family, right? And so that is sort of wrapped up in this Ashlesha energy. And last thing before I get into the recap with the yoga practices and journal prompts, is that snakes also shed their skin. And what happens is they sort of slough off the old. Sometimes it comes off in like one piece, and that's super cool. We find those in our basement sometimes because I live like out in the mountains, out in a very rural place. And so that's freaky. But if you find them, they're really cool. But what happens is right after they've shed their old skin, they are like the most vibrant, the most beautiful, the most like clear to what they look like. And then they grow. and they outgrow their old skin and they have to shed it off again. And often it comes, and so that moment while they're getting ready to shed, they look kind of dull, and like you can see the flakes starting to come, and it dulls their shine a little bit. And then they shed the skin, and they're the most shiny and vibrant and beautiful that they get, and it's a part of their growth cycle. So just keep that in mind. So the last part that I kept saying I would get back to, how that's related to lineage healing and stuff. So Cancer being related to the mother in general. So it's like maybe specifically the specific part of lineage healing that you're considering is if there's a mother wound, if there is some karma for you to work out related to nurturing, related to feeling that sense of being nurtured, nurturing yourself, and finding that sense of safety and security, and maybe even secure attachment that comes or gets disrupted by the mother, right? So there's that part, but the snake archetype also is connected in the Vedic tradition to Rahu and Ketu in Vedic astrology we see, and that's related to past lives and this life karma. I was going to say respectively, but actually that's backwards. So Ketu and Rahu, respectively, past lives and this life karma. So there's this like karmic thing, like what karmas are you working out, what past lives. And as I mentioned on the Mercury Retrograde episode, and I explained it more in depth there than I'm going to right now. My conceptualization of that is past life karma is like, it's the hand you've been dealt, like before you were ever born. That is your generational trauma or generational gifts, right? Is your past life karma. It's the hand you've been dealt from like your lineage, your ancestors, and how you play that hand you've been dealt is your this life karma, right? And that all feeds in the way that you do that is your dharma, which is what this nakshatra is related to, is dharma. And so just to tie that all up with a nice little bow, the overall energies of this new moon, before I tell you your yoga practices and journal prompts, is there's a big connection to feelings and to like what is your emotional landscape. And so I just want to remind you, as you start to think about how you're going to work with this energy, is that feelings aren't facts. In fact, feelings can be like deceptive, right? Like a snake. They can be they're not always the truth about the situation. They can often be based on past situations or reflective of our nervous system state, as I was mentioning. So feelings aren't facts, but they are signposts. So I'm a big proponent of being emotionally aware. It's like a big soapbox of mine. But I always with the caveat that I don't think you should be like just completely ruled by your feelings, just operating from an emotional state all the time. I do think there's value and benefit in being in touch with those feelings, but for the purpose of maybe being better regulated, for noticing the places that is provoking those feelings as a way to know what you need to work with. So I just want to remind you, feelings aren't facts, but they are important. They are signposts, right? And so another overall energy of this new moon and of this, I guess, time in general with the Mercury retrograde and everything is this hidden energy. But I want to really drive home the point that it's likely something right under your nose. Like that CrowdStrike example I brought up. We don't, like, that's hidden from our awareness, right? But it clearly very much affects our day-to-day life for a lot of people in a lot of big ways. And so I don't think you need to, like, look really far and wide for what is the hidden energy. Likely, to come back to that snake archetype, there might be some way that you're kind of deceiving yourself or clouding your awareness of, like, what is that truth? I'm sure you've had a glimpse of it, and I'm sure it's, like, right under your nose, right within you. Like, we don't need to look for something foreign or far away to get to. This is, like, kind of the other overall energy I wanted to point out, is that there might be something within you lying in wait, something waiting to be activated, that Kundalini awakening, that spiritual awakening that's waiting to be activated or uncovered. Like, what skin do you need to shed to live more vibrantly in your truth, right? And then another overall energy is this vibe, this snake related vibe of, just something I want to point out is the difference between medicine and poison is the dose, right? Like the antidote to the antivenom to snake venom is more of that venom, right? If that makes sense. So, and Ayurveda teaches us that too, that like, what might be medicine to one person might be poison to another, just based on what you have going on. And so what I'm trying to point to is that often we don't need to look for something far and wide outside of ourselves. We just need to look at like how much or how little we're doing something, and if that needs to be adjusted. And so the other overall energy, that snake energy of sort of like deception or maybe bending the truth. And so this is all related to our sort of internal landscapes, right? Like our emotions, our mind, our mental state. Have you been like lying to yourself about something or deceiving yourself about something? And so hopefully the journal prompts I have to share will really help you uncover that and help you work with it better. So let's talk about the yoga practices. Because of this Kundalini energy, like I was saying, the coiled snake, as much as you can incorporate spiraling movements. So that might be like a practice from Kundalini yoga is the Sufi grinds, where you're like going around in a circle from a seated position, or barrel rolling the rib cage in various shapes. You could do that in tabletop. You could do it seated. You could do it in cat-cow, making that spiraling movement of the rib cage. So the spine is sort of making this spiraling movement, like the Kundalini energy moving up the spine. Or you might also invite that sort of spiral energy by doing a mandala flow, which is where you kind of go in a full circle on the mat. Moon salutations are also like a circle energy. So I don't always say moon salutations for a new or full moon, but this one in particular, moon salutations, are a really good one to connect to that circular energy, to connect to that going to the back of the mat and then back to the front. You can also like build from there. And then another practice is exfoliate. So if you do that with like a sugar scrub or a loofah or whatever, can you like exfoliate in some way? But the Ayurvedic, I suppose, way to do it would be dry brushing. And then you could also maybe incorporate Abhyanga, especially if you tend to be more Vata in nature. But the idea with dry brushing and Abhyanga is you're starting furthest away. So you're starting with your legs, but for visual sake, you're going long strokes, and then around the joints, you're doing circular motion. And the dry brushing is extremely exfoliating, like shedding your skin, like a snake. And that could be a sort of energetic practice when you consider these journal prompts to help you really like shed whatever it is you're trying to shed. So here's your journal prompts. Number 1, what skins, I say in air quotes, do you need to shed during this Mercury retrograde? So perhaps another way to look at that is what truths have been nagging at you under the surface that need to be revealed. And like I've been saying, I don't think there's something really far and wide. I think you know. I think it's probably hard to look at. But also, this is your secret sauce. Like, this is your dharma, and I don't think it's something that's far and wide outside of you. And so just stay tuned. I have something coming your way that will help you dive into that even more, because that's what a lot of us are investigating with this whole spiritual practice in general. So stay tuned. I'm really excited about something I'm working on to help you work with that if this journal prompt is not enough. But then number 2, journal prompt, what's worth protecting for you? So if you were like a snake backed into a corner, what would you strike over to protect? And is there anything that you've maybe been sort of guarding in that way that doesn't actually feel that worth it? So maybe can you double down on the things that you do feel like would be worth striking over if you were backed into a corner, and kind of release the things that don't as much. And then related to that, to also sort of tie in the Saturn retrograde that we have going on right now, is, are there any places where you feel sort of cornered or feel like you're maybe having this emotional experience that might be related to that striking like a snake, where maybe you don't want to have that experience. And so maybe you revisit the Saturn retrograde episode from a couple weeks ago, and consider, are there any ways that you could change your constraints so you feel a little bit less backed into a corner by your circumstances. So a lot of this has to do with considering what's really important to you, what emotional states do you want to have, and how can you double down on things that provide the emotional states that you want to have, and change behaviors related to the ones that you don't, by living more in alignment with your truth. So thanks so much for being here. Be on the lookout for an email from me with sign-by-sign interpretations and a link to register for next week's live podcast recording. If you'd like to come, please remember to keep your feet on the ground, your head in the stars, and stay in the light. Until next time, take great care of yourself.